Okay, so we're back working on our head gasket job. I've gone through and checked all my valve clearances and made sure they're good. Hopefully you've gone through and checked all your valve clearances as well. Double check to make sure all your shims are in and that none of your valves are too loose or too tight. Because if you've got a too tight valve, you run the risk of burning that valve, having a misfire, and getting to do this whole job again to pull that valve out to replace it. So now that all that's set, we can go ahead and stick our distributor back in. We can stick our distributor back in. I've run the engine back over to top dead center, and we've got our single dot marks on the back of the cam gears lined up, so we know we're at top dead center on number 1. So now we can get our distributor, and we can take it, and we can take our O-ring off of here and replace that. And let me go grab my new O-ring. I'll be right back. I'm going to go ahead and just slip the new O-ring on here and just kind of roll it down until it's down here at the bottom. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of assembly grease and paint it on the O-ring to make it easy to slide in and so it doesn't stick when we're trying to rotate it. I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera. There we go. You can see there's this line right here, and if we spin the distributor shaft around, because I'm looking at the wrong angle. See if I can get that in frame. There's a line right here and then another one on the gear. So we're going to line those up, and then we're going to roughly align the center of our adjustment slot with the bolt hole for the hold down. So we're going to double check that our marks lined up. I just got it off. There we go. And as you wiggle this through here, sometimes it tries to jump. So you can just keep looking down in there and then sink it in. And as it sinks in, it's going to spin. And your rotor is going to end up kind of pointing just forward of this electrical connector. And then I'm just going to loosely put the hold down bolt in there for now. And just snug that a little bit. And now that that's in, we can actually put our valve cover on and keep moving. It's just a lot easier to verify and watch with the valve cover off as you're doing that portion. And then the first step in putting our valve cover gasket on is taking our front cam seals, and we're going to just take some of the Toyota seal packing, and we're just going to fill that groove up with it. And then we're going to come over here and we're just going to stick that down in there. Same thing on the other one. Stick it down in there. And you want a little bit to squish out the top here. Let me go ahead and cap my bottle. And then I didn't get it on film, but I've already gone and changed the rubber gasket, the valve cover gasket, and all of these spark plug tube seals. So we're ready to drop this back on. And just going to drop it on, and you're going to watch your tube seal holes, and then just kind of set it down. And as it sits down, the little squish out of sealer is what seals the corners of those cam plugs. Make sure that guy's not stuck in there. And then I'm just going to take my valve cover gasket bolts, and I'm going to thread them in. And as you tighten these, you'll notice there's a gap right here to this boss. As you tighten them, it'll squish down till that gap just closes. You don't want these real tight. You want them just tight enough to close that gap. And I usually start at the center and crisscross my way out as I'm going. And I'm going to get all these in and snugged up, and then I'll bring you back for the next step. You guys don't need to sit here and watch me stick all these bolts in. Okay, and I like to have the valve cover on here and seated before I start messing with the rest of this stuff. That way there's no chance of me dropping debris down into the engine. So now we can move over here to the side, and we can start putting our harness and our alternator and everything back in. So, you know, the alternator just goes back in the way it came. The one tip on this, there's like a spacer that floats in this front ear of the alternator bracket. If you take a punch from the inside and tap it out, like towards the front of the vehicle, it makes it a whole lot easier to slide the alternator back in, because you've got some space. You've got some space between the ears to mount that. And then we'll just come up here to the front and stick our adjustment bolt in. And I'm just going to leave all of this fairly loose for right now, because it's all going to have to be adjusted once we put the belts back on. But as you tighten this bolt up on the top, it's going to tighten that spacer back up and center the alternator better. So now that that guy's in there, we can go ahead and fish our wiring harness back down through. And, you know, normally this would be sitting, you know, up back here on the firewall, something like this. So we're going to feed all of this back down through the intake manifold. And there's a lot of it, and this is a lot of fun in the truck. But it's gonna, you know, end up something like this. With all of your injector wiring running across the top here, and then your throttle body plugs. And then you can come down here underneath and start really fishing everything back. Like there we've got our knock sensor. This long wire is going to end up coming up here to the EGR temp sensor. And I'm stuck on my microphone cord. But these guys all come up there. This long one comes down here to your oil float. These big ones plug into the trans harness. This long one slings over the top of the transmission over to your oxygen sensors and transmission temp switch. And then this bigger one also swings over there and it goes to the park neutral switch. This one comes up here. It's a ground. It goes on the back of the intake right here. And I'm going to grab a bolt here in a second. And then you've got one that's triangle shaped, and it comes down here to the bottom and goes to the crank sensor. And then you've got this set that kind of come across to the top and go to all the temp sensor plugs up here in the head. And then there's one more knock sensor right down here. And this is way more of a struggle when this is in the vehicle. And then you've got your starter wire over there, your actual power wire. I'm gonna stick my ground wire up here before I forget about it. Okay, and normally there are clips and stuff in here that all this snaps back into. They've all completely rotted off on this truck. So I'm gonna come back through later with zip ties and tie everything up. Let me just fish this stuff up here. And then let me go grab, we can start putting our fuel rail in. So let me grab that and I'll be right back. Okay, so now we're ready to start putting our fuel injectors back in. I've already changed the top O-ring and the little insulator spacer. And then there's a chunkier O-ring that goes down here on the bottom. I like to stick those down in the intake manifold first. That way they're not all falling off while I'm trying to put the injectors in. And then I just take a little bit of silicone spray and spritz those upper O-rings to make sure they slide easily into the fuel rail and don't bind and pinch and tear, because there's not much worse than getting this all back together and then pulling it back apart because you tore an O-ring. So now, our fuel rail's here, and we can just start sticking and just gently wiggling the injectors in there. We can take our spacers, and those seat down here where the rail sits. I'll just drop them on their seats. And then we can fish the rail down in here. And then we'll just plug the injectors down into the bigger O-rings that we already put. And this is kind of a juggling match, but there we go. And we'll get all those guys down in there. And then we can start these long bolts that hold the fuel rail down. And then before I get too far, I like to go ahead and plug my fuel rail harness connectors in. And give everything a wiggle to make sure it's seated properly. And you just want to listen for all these to click as you're sticking them down in there. And then once that's on, we can go around here to the end and click that guy on. We can also fish our fuel return line onto the end of the regulator. I'm going to put the clamp on that before I forget. There we go. Before I tighten the rail all the way up, I want to go ahead and hook the line that comes through down here to the fuel filter. So I've got my banjo bolt. I'm going to take 2 of my aluminum crush washers that came with the new fuel filter. There's also some of them in the head gasket set. We're going to put one on the banjo bolt. We're going to put the banjo bolt through the banjo fitting, and then stick the other washer between it and the fuel filter. And then we're going to drop one of them. And a lot of times this line gets a little kinked as you're pulling everything in and out, which is why it's easier to do this with the fuel rail a little bit loose, because it gives you some play. So you can get this line started without cross-threading it. I'm just going to snug that up for now. I'll come back and actually torque it when I do the front one, when I put the engine back in the truck. So now that that's on, I can tighten up the 3 fuel rail bolts. And once those are tight, I like to go back again and give all my injectors a wiggle to make sure nothing's bound up and that everything's happy, and it is. So now we can put our upper intake on. And I've already gone through with a Scotch-Brite pad and cleaned up. Oops. And if we put these in the right spots, they're a lot easier to line up. I've already cleaned up the tops of the manifold, or the gasket surfaces. And then here's our upper plenum. And you'll notice back here, there's a vacuum line that goes through a little pipe. I don't know if you can see that back here. Make sure you run a piece of welding wire or something through there, and it comes out up on the top right here. That's what controls your EGR, and it's real common for these to be plugged. This one was all clogged up, and I had to take a drill bit and clean it out. But you've got your EGR vacuum switching valve, and I think this one's emissions, but I'm not entirely certain. I've never actually changed either of the front two. I've only ever messed with the back one. So yeah, and check your vacuum lines in there. And then we'll set this back down, and then you can see these 2 vacuum lines coming down the bottom are the ones that go down to that little vacuum switch. And there we go. We'll get that seated in there. And you just kind of want to look and make sure nothing's pinched or stuck anywhere. And we can take this vacuum line, stick it on the fuel pressure regulator, and then we can stick these 2 guys down here on the vacuum switch. And then we can go ahead and put all of our intake bolts back in here and torque them up to 15 foot-pounds. I'll go ahead and do that off camera, and I'll be right back. Okay, so we've got our upper intake all torqued back on. And here you can see where I've pulled that one random wire up and clipped it for this sensor. On a lot of these, there's a bracket that goes from here down to here on the block. For some reason, those tend to get lost over the years. This one's missing it, but yours may have this bracket. And if so, you'll want to put that back in at this point. I also forgot to show there's a little throttle body hose that goes up here, or goes on here on the block, or head, and then feeds up to the throttle body, and we'll get to the other side of that in a bit. Don't forget to put that on while you're under here. And then we can also come and we can put our power steering reservoir on now. And it's just 3 12-millimeter headed bolts. And that way this isn't flopping around anymore. And I also plugged my distributor harness in, although I put that in the wrong way. That goes that way. I'm not going to put the cap and rotor on or the cap and wires on until we've got this back in the truck, just because it's kind of a pain and they're easy to break with the engine hoist. Actually, you know what? I am going to put them on right now. I'm going to undo this again real quick. I am going to put them on. That way I can go ahead and put the throttle body on. And when we took them out, we left them all whole. So we can just stick the cap on there. And loosely start these. And we can just go down the line and drop them back in the holes. And a lot of times I'll put some dielectric grease on the ends of the boots before I put them down in. This one's already got dielectric on it, so we're not going to add more. We can just press all those in there. And then we can tighten up our cap. And we'll just be really careful when we put this ball back together. Now I can go ahead and fish this back through and plug that in. And we can also take our breather hose or PCV hose and stick that on the PCV valve. And we can click our harness that feeds all the vacuum switching valves down below. We can click that on there. Okay, so so that's everything on this side, except you've got a ground here, and you'll have a ground that'll come up here and bolt onto the engine harness, or engine lifting point rather. And you've got to do your fuel supply line and plug in these and your vacuum line that goes here over to the charcoal canister and your fuel return line there, which obviously are in the truck and we can't see them right now, and your brake booster up here. So let me spin this around and we'll start in on the other side. Okay, so now I've got you flipped back around to the other side. I've gone ahead and put the bolt in for the upper heater pipe. And now we can go ahead and put our EGR valve on. And we're just going to kind of slip it on there and loosely start the big nut. And then, I was not prepared for this. We can take one of the studs that we took out and our EGR valve gasket and slip the gasket in there and then slip the stud through it and start it into the manifold. You want to make absolutely certain that you're not cross-threading here. Somebody's been in this engine before and has done a lot of cross-threading. So it's been a lot of fun getting some of these bolts started straight. So we're going to tighten that stud back in there. And I'm just using a E-type's torque socket. On the other side, when we took it out, the nut stayed with it. So I'm just going to let that fly. And I'm going to fish that stud through my gasket. And I'm going to look down here to make sure my gasket's lined up and that my stud's going in straight. And I'm going to start ratcheting that down. Actually, I'm going to do that with the E-socket. And now we can come back and grab my nut. And we can tighten up the nuts. And then this hose up here is the one that feeds down to that pipe on the back of the manifold. So we'll stick that guy down there. We can get our throttle body hardware out. And our throttle body gasket. We'll stick that on there. Then we're going to take our throttle body, and that hose that came up from the bottom, from the head, goes on the back of the throttle body, or the back coolant line. And we'll feed our clamp up in there. And I'm going to move my gasket because I'm going to drop that. Then we're going to fish that down in there. And you know what? I stuck all this together without putting my front coolant pipe on. So I'm going to have to feed that through in a minute. But otherwise, you would have this hose going to that steel line that comes around from right here and comes around the front of the engine. So I'll fish that in a little bit. And we'll go ahead and put our throttle body on. I'm going to stick my gasket back down in there. And stick the throttle body on. And then it's the two short bolts that go in the top. Like so. And then the two longer ones fish down through the bottom here. We just can get those snug for now. Go. Then we can go ahead and torque those to 15. And double check that. Then we can go ahead and plug in our idle air control valve and our throttle position sensor. And we can hook these vacuum lines up right here. Excuse me. And we can stick our covers on here. And this one's missing a couple of screws, so I'm gonna have to dig up the bolt that goes here and the bolt that goes here. But now that those are on, we can stick our breather valve or breather hose back on there. And we can stick our EGR modulator back in and hook all its hoses up. Like so. And then, you know, in the truck, you would go ahead and hook your throttle cables and all that back up. I'm not going to put the exhaust manifolds back on until we're back in the truck. And I'm also going to leave, there's a coolant pipe that sits here, and then you're also going to have another engine bracket and a ground strap that's back here. I'm going to leave all that out of my way until I get this back in the truck. I am going to put my heater pipe in, if I can find my pick. Here it is. Or my bypass pipe, rather. So we've got 3 bigger O-rings in the kit, and I've got too many things in my hands. These go on this little cooling pipe, and then one goes in the end of this pipe, and it kind of just squishes in there. I'll set that one down for a second. I'm going to spray a little silicone on this pipe before I stick it down in the bore, and that just helps it seat better and not gouge the O-rings. And I'm going to set that one in on top of it. And I'm going to grab my 2 bolts. And I'm going to snug these down to 15 as well. And there you go. At this point, you're pretty close to done. You know, you've just got the exhaust manifolds and this heater pipe and a couple of brackets on here. I'm not going to put them on, like I said, because they're going to be in the way of dropping the engine back in. It's kind of hard to fight the downpipe and the manifolds there. So yeah, at this point, you're pretty much done. You've got to hook up the random hoses that go to the body of the truck that we don't have here. But yeah, that's finalizing a head gasket on an 80 series Land Cruiser. Hope you found that useful. If you did, please subscribe below. If you found it super useful, check out our Patreon link down in the description. We always appreciate the support, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in.